After taking on the blazing hot fire type in our last catching challenge, I knew we would have to tackle the remaining types in the starter trio, grass and water. But these two are quite a bit more common than their scorching sibling, with water's abundance and title of most frequent type being as notorious as Generation 4's lack of flames. That's why today we are going to be double dipping, covering both the grass and water challenges in one. To my surprise, some of the adventures we'll be taking on were not what I was expecting, and had me diving into some topics on these games you might not even know about. So go ahead and let me know down below which type you think will be more of a challenge in the end as we check out just how fast you can catch a grass or a water type in every Pokemon game. Kicking this off with our first grass hunt, Generation 1 holds a solid 5 non-starter lines, and while our fire experience might make us think we are stuck with the version exclusives of Oddish and Bellsprout already, Paris can actually be found a bit earlier in Mount Moon. And with this also holding in yellow version but only being slower, our first grass type is set, letting us float on over to the water type. And despite the already high count featured in these games, there's fittingly not a single water type in the standard grass encounters here, with the only overworld encounters coming from when we can surf or surf down to the Seafoam Islands. And even with plenty of water around us from the start of the game, the earliest fishing rod isn't even until Vermilion anyways. However, just before our grassy little guy Paris is Mount Moon's Pokemon Center, where of course the infamous Magikarp salesman provides us the clear winner and first water type of our challenge. However, it seems we won't be as lucky in the next games because Bellsprout is of course a core part of Johto's early game, with Sprout Tower and encounters as early as Route 31 in all games. Now Johto also introduces a well-known early Grassmon in Hoppip, but that can't be found until after Violet City, at least in the base games because Crystal adds Hoppip to Route 30, beating out Bellsprout by almost 2 minutes. But of course, things are never quite so easy, as Hoppip has just a 5% encounter here, meaning we need to make sure the odds are still in the flying plant's favor, and since there aren't any tricks we can take advantage of, Hoppip is expected to be encountered in about 4 minutes and 20 seconds, which actually leaves the unsurprising Sprout as a much safer catch with its 25% encounter rate combined with a 5% Hoppip as well in Crystal. Thus, we now get our first of the Gen 1 version exclusive catches we became so familiar with last time. But Crystal's updated Route 30 isn't going completely unused because it also adds a water type in Poliwag to the grass at a solid 20% at night, locking in another catch. And while the fishing rod is even earlier in these games, just after Violet City, the base game's best option beats that anyways with Wooper at night on the same route, which means neither game needs to deal with any rods and simply must be played at night to finish up the second generation. Now while Hoenn doesn't throw in any Bellsprout and only forces us plenty of Oddish after Slateport, the region hosts its own early version exclusive grass types, as Seedot and Lotad both can be found on Route 102 in their respective games at 20%. But since Emerald also holds a 1% chance to find Seedot along with the Sapphire Lotad odds, and the games are practically tied up to this point, we can stick with the upper version and get our grass type. And although Lotad can of course double as a water type answer, these are not actually the first of the type we can encounter, since another Hoenn staple in Wingull can be found earlier when we visit Route 103 and take on our rival. But we can't actually catch anything until finishing that and returning to the lab, at which point Route 102 is open anyways. Now Wingull's encounter rate in Emerald does tie any Lotads, but Sapphire also comes with a 1% chance for Surskit, giving it the slightest edge. Or at least it would if the two routes were equal distance from one another. But after doing a quick check, Route 103 is actually 6 steps closer, and since the time spent searching on average will be about the same, going north for Wingull is both reasonable and the fastest possible option, giving Emerald a pair of wins. And while we could get back into the weeds in Sinnoh, Diamond and Pearl's regional dex actually features the fewest number of grass types so far, making it even more apparent who the winner is in Budew just above Jubilife, not even needing to dodge the trainer thanks to the fenced area, which is a bit faster in the base games due to Looker's Mandibule mandatory cutscene just before this encounter in Platinum. But now it's finally time to deal with a fishy situation, because these games feature the earliest fishing rods so far in the western exit from Jubilife, with a fishing spot just a few steps further on Route 218 for guaranteed Magikarps. And while this is the answer for the base games, Platinum does provide a competitor, because something I missed in the good old Psyduck challenge, this game ups the duck's odds in the nearby Ravage path from 2% all the way to 35. After doing a bit of comparison, we can in fact reach Ravage path and an encounter twice as fast as a first fishing hit when going for the rod. Thus, although not guaranteed, Psyduck is both a contender and the optimal choice for the fastest water type in Platinum thanks to those upped odds. For both of our types, the remakes certainly recreate our prior experiences, with the Kanto and Sinnoh games being the exact same. And for the other two games, both grass results end up the same, with Bellsprout in Heart Gold and the version exclusives in Oraz. However, the water options at least give us something. Well, sort of, because although Primo's Egg we used for Slugma last time has a Wooper option, and that might just barely beat out the time it would take to beat the gym and head south, thanks to a newly added patch of grass on the southern route, we can simply grab Wooper without the gym progression previously required. And what might there be in Hoenn, given our water options are the same? Well, Lotad's encounter rate was actually dropped by 5%, while Wingull up on 103 is doubled to match what we had in Emerald. And reaching Route 102 now requires you to hit a load screen, unlike 103, making its trip over a second faster, further pushing Wingull into the lead here, and us over to the next generation with Black and White, where, of course, the elemental monkeys will end up as our fastest options again. But if we wanted to ignore these two, the results do change this time, because even though there are no other grass types until Pinwheel Forest where we can encounter the monkeys naturally, they require Shaking Grass, and are only 10% shots, all while a Plasma Grunt will stop us from having full reach of the area if there even was an immediate patch to check. Instead, normal grass encounters have a 35% shot for the new version exclusive grass types, and a 35% shot for the bug grass Soatl, leaving these encounters as our winner. Meanwhile, the non-monkey water type is simply on the outer area of Pinwheel Forest, accessible even before the second gym with Tympole. But luckily, the sequels remove any of these Giftmon questions, because Soatl can actually be found again on just the second route of the game, along with a 25% for Sunkern in the summer. And with our water type just a few steps further in Flocacy Ranch, and once again our old pal Psyduck, the Unova region starter types are complete. But we aren't free from those elemental monkeys yet, because Kalos doesn't have any water or grass type options on its first route, leaving Panpour and Sage in Santaloon Forest as the winners without a gift. But for the heck of it, if we just pretend they never existed at all, the results would instead be another Psyduck we have covered in the past on Route 22 for the water type, and then for grass, since we know how slow leveling Burmy is from the Seal video, we can simply beat the gym to access Route 4 for Budew at 10% in any flowers. Although, at that point, maybe we should just stick with the monkeys anyways. Thankfully though, for the first time in the series, I can be happy about restarting the Alolan games, because the monkey trio are not showing up. Instead, we head straight for Melemele Meadow to obtain the Black and White version exclusives at 30% in the base games, 10% better than the already behind Ultra versions. And our water catch just needs us to reach the beach, where outside Kukui's house we can encounter both Wingull and Slowpoke at 50 and 20% respectively in all games. And since we found the games are tied up to this point in the Dark Vid, we can stick to the base games and end up with another Wingull. Back to Kanto and Let's Go, the Fire video had us catching a Charmander, being a rare spawn just after beating Brock, and we can of course catch the other two starters in the wild too, with Bulbasaur being found as soon as we reach Viridian Forest. But these games actually go back to our initial version exclusive assumption by throwing in Bellsprout and Oddish as soon as possible on Route 1 as 30% encounters, finally forcing more of these onto us. And on the water side of things, sadly for the starters, Squirtle can't be found until Route 24, and even the extra Psyducks there and on Route 4 can't save us from the inevitability of everyone's favorite Magikarp salesman, leaving us stuck with a Magikarp purchase before Mount Moon in every Kanto run of the challenge. Meanwhile, Galar's grass option isn't much of a worry either, as although there aren't any new grass version exclusives, Sword and Shield mark the earliest return of Gen 3's pair with Lotad and Seedot on Route 2 as 20% hidden encounters. Which lets us get to the fun part, because although Lotad is right point there to again double as a water option, these games hand us the earliest fishing rod in the series, practically starting with it being included in our bag a few steps after we gain control. So the question becomes, are there any early fishing spots to take advantage of? Specifically because also on Route 2, we can find Galler's brand new Choodle as a 10% visible encounter, and while its one-time static spawn only shows up after we progress further on the route, it doesn't change the fact that the time it takes to reach Route 2 is all we have to work with here. Now while there is no water on the prior route, the one other location we get to explore before this, the Slumbering Weald, does in fact have water and fishing spots within its woods. However, there are some major problems with this. Now it's not necessarily that we don't have balls during our scripted visits, since there would be plenty of time to backtrack after we get some. Rather, at that point, the woods are again blocked off to us and won't be open again until all the way in the post-game. Additionally, even if we had balls during the first visit, we can't even reach the fishing points thanks to the legendary encounter stopping our progression. And as you might have guessed, that also means the Mons would far exceed our catch level limit, even if we could find a way to reach them and had Pokeballs. But we won't come away completely empty-handed and chewed up here, because what I saw just below the encounter data on Bulbapedia was well worth this check alone. There, an interesting tidbit regarding these fishing spots notes that aside from the one spot near the waterfall, all fishing events are flagged not to spawn Magikarp, as would be expected in this area based on the game's also documented area encounter tables. Thankfully, this note was properly cited and led to a Reddit post by the editor with further information on the matter, and I was very surprised to see that it was posted quite recently. Now it turns out this information had been known prior, and the poster simply did their own bit of work and wanted to document this matter a bit better. But moreover, they explain what was found to be going on here, and in the 3 other locations that also have this interesting behavior, as the devs actually included a method for skipping the final slot in an encounter table and use that to restrict where the full table would be used in these 4 areas. But then the question here is, of course, why? Something the poster also didn't seem to understand, and I had yet to see any answers to. Well, first off, someone did respond to the post that was involved in the original explanation of the behavior. Who else but Anubis, the Pokemon researcher we often end up finding when digging into Switch mechanics. They explained how they ran into this question, specifically due to fishing for the rare 1% Lapras encounter on Route 9, and wanting to answer why it could only be found in the single fishing spot. Now you would think there might be a rarity relationship between these unique fishing choices. For example, the 1% Lapras is the only way to fish one up, and thus have a shot at a fishing mark, and at best 3 out of 25 chance, which is all made even more difficult to obtain since players would have to realize or learn about this detail to even start getting encounter attempts. However, the other 3 Pokemon aren't at all as exclusive, each having plenty of other locations to be fished up across the game. So while rarity appears to explain why the developers chose to restrict Lapras, it doesn't explain the other 3, only making things more confusing since that Lapras example seems so purposeful. But rarity of the Pokemon might not be the only way to look at this, as the fishing holes themselves could possibly be part of the reasoning, since each of these 4 do seem to stand out in some way, with Motostoke being a unique spot in the center of the city far from the 2 others, Route 9's also being relatively central and tucked away comparatively, Slumbering Weald's requiring us to be on a fallen tree to again fish atop a small fall, and finally Hulberry's is relatively uninteresting, but is still the furthest and only spot not within the dock area. And while it's hard to say if these details truly were part of the decision, there is one more explanation we can throw in, because if we jump back to our Slumbering Weald Magikarp, remember it sits at the top of a waterfall, and although not very large, Magikarp's evolution to Gyarados has a lot of evidence for being inspired by the Chinese Dragon Gate myth, where carps which could leap up falls would be transformed into dragons. While this has been pointed at in various Pokemon media like the anime and cards, there are some in-game examples, the earliest seemingly being the classic Pokemon Snap evolution with Gyarados appearing from a waterfall. But most recently, Legends Arceus featured an even more direct reference, with the waterfall in Fabled Springs hosting a school of carp at the base, while Gyarados can be found in the water atop the falls. And with this game's proximity to Sword and Shield, it certainly adds to the theories of what's going on here. But with all that covered, fishing is still not an option for us, and we of course have to end this run by falling back to Route 2, where if we spot a Choodle, are at least left with a new Mon for the challenge. But now we can move on to Legends proper, where sadly we won't be getting any Gyarados atop the falls, nor Carp for that matter, because of course Buizel is one of the featured Mons of the introductory missions and can be caught just a bit earlier by simply skipping out on said missions and running straight to its location. And while Buizel is a rather dull but at least new catch in the challenge, our grass options here are a bit more exciting, at least in terms of our series. To start, there is just one grass line walking about the fieldlands at the moment, that being Paris again. However, it requires us to have access to the central island, which we can't do until fulfilling a chunk of the intro. And while one of the other two remaining grass types also requires this prerequisite with Leafeon, the final one doesn't, that being Wormadam and its Plant Cloak, the bug which has been a staple in our most recent challenges. Now at first, I thought there might be a decent gamble here since Burmy is also in the fieldlands, and both Mons are frequent shaking tree options here. However, not only are most trees with the line either one or the other as the only possible encounters, with just a few containing both and a low chance for the evolution, of the trees which can shake in the initially accessible area, all of them are for some reason the Wormadam only trees rather than Burmy, seemingly a bit contradictory given the lower level pre-evolution trees requiring the additional progression. I would imagine this is simply due to the southwestern areas past the Alpha Snorlax being intended for a later visit, and the obvious outlier tree that is nearest camp is not reachable at this point in the game, but is funnily interactable if it does happen to hold the Wormadam encounter. Thus, the strategy itself here is simple, running to check each of these trees while heading southwest until we find a shaking one, which guarantees the encounter, and at a 34% catch rate, it won't take much more to finally let us crown Wormadam as a winner in our series. Lastly, Gen 9 is far from shy in terms of options for our two types, with Grassmon showing up as soon as we can catch anything on Pokepath in another Hoppip win, and Water types making us wait a bit more until we can access South Prop 1 in its entirety. Or at least that's the expectation based on the spawns we can access within these areas. However, we of course have a whole beach at our disposal if we head back to Nemona's, and while the South Sea spawns don't seem particularly intended to be interacted with at this point, thanks to the high density of those spawns surrounding the area, if we hang out at the northernmost point of the beach, we can in fact initiate a battle with them. And thanks to Wingull and its sporadic flying, this can be done relatively quickly, locking in our final Watermon and ending our double type challenge. So with the other two starter types taken down, we end up with a pair of total times, 4 hours 51 minutes and 35 seconds for the grass type, and 4 hours 9 minutes and 1 second for water, locking in water as the probably expected quicker to pick up type, but both as the fastest challenges we've had to date. Taking on the pair was a fun spin for sure, and there were a few stories here I was excited to stumble upon. With that said, I have a few ideas of what to take on next. There are a couple types I could still see being interesting, some specific mons or other categories, but I would love to hear what you might want. And big updates for those Roses fans, I just finished recording for this script right before this, and in combination with lots of prep work for the editing I'll be doing soon, I'm really excited to share that Roses is on the horizon, so keep an eye out because there'll definitely be more on that soon. Thank you all so much for hanging on for it. It's been a huge endeavor, but I'm really excited to show you what we have going on there. So more on that soon. But with that said, thanks so much as always for the support and patience while I work on these projects. I hope you enjoyed this one, and more to come soon.